Welcome to Twilight Fables. Tonight, you will not follow a tale of battle or conquest. Instead, you will walk a quieter path. A path shaped not by force, but by patience. And not by urgency, but by understanding. This is the story of Zhuge Liang, a man remembered not only for what he achieved, but for the way he carried himself through a restless world. Long before his name was known beyond distant valleys, he lived in stillness, observing, listening, and allowing the world to reveal itself without haste. And tonight, you will step into that stillness. There is nothing you need to solve. There is nothing you need to follow closely. There is only a story to move with, at its own pace. So allow yourself to settle. Let the day fall away, gently and without effort. As we begin, we find ourselves in a quiet valley, far from the noise of the world, where the morning mist lingers, and a man sits unseen at the edge of something that has yet to begin. In the quiet valley of Longjong, where the mountains rose like patient guardians, and the mornings arrived wrapped in silver mist, there lived a man who had no need to be known. His name was Zhuge Liang. At that time, he was not spoken of in the courts of rulers, nor written about in the records of generals. There were no titles attached to his name, no banners, no honors. Only a small cottage stood at the edge of cultivated land, where the earth had been turned by steady hands, and the seasons were followed without urgency. The valley itself seemed to exist outside the reach of ambition. Narrow paths curved between quiet fields, and clusters of bamboo leaned gently in the wind, their leaves whispering in tones too soft to carry meaning, yet somehow never empty. In the early hours, before the sun had fully risen, the air held a stillness that felt complete, untouched by expectation. It was during these hours that Zhuge Liang preferred to wake. He would step outside without haste, pausing just long enough to take in the faint outline of the mountains against the lightening sky. There was no ritual to this pause, no deliberate meditation, only a quiet acknowledgement of the world as it was. The ground beneath his feet was cool, the air carried the scent of damp soil, and somewhere in the distance, water moved in a slow, continuous flow. He did not try to hold on to these moments. He simply noticed them, and then continued with his day. His life was, by all appearances, simple. He tended to the land with care, not out of necessity alone, but because it gave shape to time. The work of planting, watering, and waiting asked nothing more than attention, and in return, it offered a steady rhythm. There were no sudden demands, no urgent decisions, only the quiet understanding that growth could not be hurried. Inside his cottage, a single wooden table stood near a window that opened toward the eastern hills. Upon it were a few scrolls neatly arranged, and a brush that had been cleaned and set aside with precision. The room held very little, yet nothing within it felt lacking. Each object had its place, and each place seemed to have been chosen without excess thought. When Zhuge Liang sat at the table, he did not always read. Sometimes he would unroll a scroll and allow his eyes to move across the characters slowly, as though each word carried more than its shape suggested. At other times, he would leave the scroll untouched, his gaze drifting instead toward the open window, where the movement of light and shadow unfolded without instruction. There were thoughts, of course. There were always thoughts, but he did not chase them. They came and went like the wind through the bamboo, present for a moment, then gone without resistance. In their place remained a kind of clarity that was neither forced nor fragile. It did not depend on silence, nor did it disappear with noise. It was simply there, as steady as the ground beneath him. Travelers passed through Longzhong from time to time. Most did not stay long. The valley offered little to those in search of opportunity, and even less to those chasing recognition. Yet occasionally, someone would linger. A farmer from a neighboring region, perhaps, or a messenger taking a longer road for reasons of his own. It was through such travelers that Zhuge Liang's name began, slowly and almost unintentionally, to move beyond the valley. They would speak of a man who lived quietly, yet seemed to understand more than he revealed. A man who, when asked a question, did not rush to answer. But when he did speak, his words carried a weight that did not need to be explained. He did not offer advice freely, nor did he withhold it out of caution. Instead, he listened. When a traveler spoke of uncertainty, of shifting alliances, of distant conflicts, of lands governed by men who sought power without balance, Zhuge Liang would not interrupt. He would allow the words to settle, as though giving them space to become clear, even to the one who spoke them. Only after a pause would he respond. And even then, his answers were not grand. He might speak of timing, not in terms of strategy, but in the way seasons followed one another without resistance. He might mention that action, when taken too early, often created more difficulty than delay, or that clarity did not come from forcing decisions, but from allowing confusion to pass on its own. To some, this seemed unsatisfying. They had come looking for certainty, for direction that could be followed without question. Instead, they were given something quieter, something that required patience. Yet others left with a different understanding. They carried with them the sense that not everything needed to be resolved immediately, that not every path had to be chosen in haste, and that perhaps the world was not as chaotic as it first appeared, if one learned to observe it without urgency. As the days moved gently into one another, the valley remained unchanged. The fields continued to grow in their own time. The bamboo bent and straightened with the passing wind. The mornings arrived, and the evenings followed, each without announcement. And within this steady rhythm, Zhuge Liang remained as he always had. He did not seek to leave the valley. He did not seek to be found. Yet beyond the quiet hills of Longzhong, the world was beginning to shift. Leaders rose and fell. Lands were divided and contested. Decisions were made in haste, and their consequences spread outward, touching even the places that seemed most distant from conflict. It was only a matter of time before those who carried greater burdens would begin to search, not for strength, nor for power, but for something far less visible: clarity. And when that search began, it would lead them, slowly and with intention, toward the quiet valley where a man lived without the need to be known. For now, however, the valley remained still. The light of the morning settled softly across the land. The air moved gently through the trees. And within the small cottage at the edge of the fields, Zhuge Liang sat in quiet thought, his presence unchanged by the distant movements of a world that had not yet reached him. There was no urgency in his breath, no tension in his posture, only the quiet continuation of a life lived with attention and without excess. And in that stillness, unnoticed by most, something enduring was already taking shape, not in the form of action or recognition or achievement, but in the steady, unspoken presence of a mind that did not need to rush. Great, Let's continue in the same tone and pacing, keeping it narrative-driven and grounded in legacy, without slipping into repetition or intensity. Beyond the quiet valley of Longzhong, the world had grown restless. Across distant provinces, lands shifted hands with uncertain rhythm. Alliances were formed and broken with equal ease, and those who sought to lead often found themselves surrounded by voices that spoke quickly, but not always wisely. In such a world, decisions were made not in stillness, but in urgency. And urgency, more often than not, left little room for clarity. Among those moving through this uncertain landscape was a man named Liu Bei. He was not unfamiliar with hardship. His path had been marked by loss, by long stretches of wandering, and by a quiet persistence that had yet to find its place. Though he carried the bearing of someone who sought to restore order, he did so without the advantage of certainty. His efforts, though steady, had not yet taken root in a way that could endure. It was during this time that he began to hear, in passing and without insistence, of a man who lived far from the centers of power. The accounts were not dramatic. No one spoke of great victories or decisive influence. Instead, there were only quiet remarks of a scholar who did not seek recognition, and of conversations that seemed to linger long after they had ended. Some described him as thoughtful, others as reserved. A few spoke of a clarity in his words that felt uncommon, though they struggled to explain why. The name, when it was mentioned, was simple: Zhuge Liang. Liu Bei did not respond to this information immediately. He had heard many such things before, stories of individuals whose reputations grew larger in the telling. Yet there was something in the way these accounts were shared that held his attention. They were not offered as persuasion, nor as praise. They were simply observations, spoken without expectation. And so, after some time had passed, he made the decision to seek this man out. The journey to Longzhong was not difficult, but neither was it direct. The roads that led there narrowed gradually, giving way to quieter paths that seemed less traveled with each passing mile. The sounds of movement, the clatter of hooves, the distant hum of activity faded into something softer until they were replaced by the steady presence of wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. When Liu Bei arrived at the edge of the valley, he did not announce himself. There was no need. The cottage stood where it had always stood, unchanged by the passage of those who came and went. The fields nearby bore the marks of recent care, and the surrounding land carried the quiet order of someone who moved through it with intention. But on that first visit, Zhuge Liang was not there. Liu Bei waited for a time, though not long enough to call it patience. The stillness of the place did not invite interruption, yet it did not offer answers either. After a while, he turned back, leaving as he had arrived, without ceremony. The valley returned to its quiet. Days passed. Then, after some thought, Liu Bei returned. The second journey felt different, though the path itself had not changed. There was less urgency in his steps, and a greater willingness to allow the distance to unfold as it would. When he reached the cottage once more, the scene was much the same. The door remained closed. The air remained still. Again, Zhuge Liang was not there. This time, Liu Bei stayed a little longer. He walked the perimeter of the small clearing, taking in the details that might have gone unnoticed before. The way the bamboo leaned just slightly toward the open field, the careful arrangement of tools near the edge of the land, the subtle signs of a life lived without excess. There was no frustration in his waiting. though there could have been. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that not all meetings could be arranged by intention alone. Eventually, he left once more. The valley, unchanged, continued as it always had. It was only on the third visit that the rhythm shifted. The journey itself carried a sense of completion, not in the sense of expectation, but in the simple understanding that something had been allowed to unfold in its own time. When Liu Bei arrived, the morning light had just begun to settle across the valley, soft and unhurried. This time, the door to the cottage was open. Zhuge Liang sat inside, near the window, as though he had been there all along. There was no surprise in his expression, nor any indication that he had been expecting a visitor. He did not rise immediately, nor did he speak. Instead, he allowed the moment to settle, giving space to the quiet that already filled the room. Liu Bei stepped inside without haste. For a brief time, neither man spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It did not carry the weight of uncertainty, nor the need to be filled. It was simply there, present, steady, and without demand. When Zhuge Liang finally looked up, his gaze was calm, neither searching nor dismissive. "You have come some distance," he said. The words were simple, offered without assumption. Liu Bei inclined his head slightly. "I have." There was no immediate continuation, no request, no declaration. The purpose of the visit, though understood, did not need to be stated all at once. Zhuge Liang gestured toward a place to sit. Tea was prepared in the same manner it always had been. Water poured, leaves steeped, cups set down with care. The movements were unhurried, each step carried out with a familiarity that required no thought. Only after the tea had been placed between them did the conversation begin. Liu Bei spoke not of ambition, but of uncertainty. He spoke of a world that seemed to move without balance, of efforts made with sincerity that had yet to find their direction. He did not seek to present himself as capable, nor did he attempt to persuade. Instead, he spoke plainly, allowing the weight of his experience to be felt without embellishment. Zhuge Liang listened. He did not interrupt, nor did he offer immediate response. His attention remained steady, as it had with the travelers who came before. But there was a depth to it now, shaped not by the words themselves, but by the intention behind them. When Liu Bei finished, the room grew quiet once more. The steam from the tea had begun to fade. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of leaves shifting against one another. Zhuge Liang considered his reply, not as one choosing the right words, but as one allowing the necessary ones to emerge. "The world does not lack for action," he said at last, "but it is often moved without understanding." His voice was even, without emphasis. To act without clarity is to follow the same path as those who came before. The outcome may differ in appearance, but not in nature. He paused, not for effect, but because there was no need to rush. If you seek to restore order, you must first understand how it was lost. The words settled into the space between them. There was no instruction to follow, no immediate solution offered, only a direction, one that required time, patience, and a willingness to see beyond what was already known. Liu Bei did not respond immediately. He did not need to. The conversation continued, slowly and without urgency, moving through ideas not as problems to be solved, but as patterns to be understood. There were no raised voices, no moments of intensity, only the steady exchange of thought, shaped by a shared recognition that clarity could not be forced. Outside, the day moved forward. The valley remained as it had always been, quiet, unchanged, and untouched by the concerns of the wider world. Yet within the small cottage at its edge, something had begun, not with declaration, nor with agreement, but with understanding. And in that understanding, the foundation of a legacy had taken its first quiet step forward. The conversation did not conclude in a single sitting. It unfolded across the day and then quietly into the next. There was no sense of urgency between the two men, no need to arrive at decisions quickly, nor to press toward conclusions that had not yet taken shape. Instead, their exchanges followed a steady rhythm, one that allowed each thought to be considered fully before another took its place. In the small cottage at the edge of the valley, time seemed to move differently. The light shifted slowly across the floor, stretching and retreating as the hours passed. Outside, the wind continued its quiet movement through the bamboo, unchanged by the presence of those within. And inside, the conversation between Zhuge Liang and Liu Bei deepened, not in intensity, but in clarity. It was during one such moment, as the afternoon light softened toward evening, that Liu Bei spoke again. "If understanding is the beginning," he said, his voice measured, "then where does one begin to look?" The question was not hurried. It carried no frustration, only a quiet willingness to learn. Zhuge Liang did not answer immediately. He reached for a scroll, though he did not open it at once. Instead, he held it lightly in his hands, as though considering not the contents within, but the question itself. "When the world appears unsettled," he said after a time, "it is often because it has moved away from what once gave it balance." His gaze remained steady. To restore that balance, one must first see the shape of what has been lost. He unrolled the scroll slowly, revealing a simple map, not marked by elaborate detail, but by broad regions, rivers, and the natural boundaries that had long defined the land. "There are places that endure," he continued, "not because they are strong, but because they are positioned in such a way that they do not need to struggle." His hand moved across the map, not with precision, but with familiarity. "And there are places that weaken, not from lack of effort, but from being drawn into conflict that does not serve them." Liu Bei leaned slightly forward, though his attention remained calm. He did not interrupt. Zhuge Liang's words did not come as instruction, nor as a declaration of strategy. Instead, they unfolded as observations, each one building gently upon the last, forming a picture that was not forced into clarity, but allowed to emerge. "To act without understanding these patterns," Zhuge Liang said, "is to move in response to the moment alone." He looked toward the open window briefly, where the last of the daylight lingered against the hills. "But to act with understanding is to move in alignment with what has already taken shape." There was no emphasis in his voice, no need to persuade. The weight of his words came not from how they were spoken, but from the stillness that surrounded them. Liu Bei considered this. In the past, he had been offered plans, detailed, ambitious, and often immediate. They spoke of victories to be won, territories to be claimed, and actions to be taken without delay. But this was different. There was no urgency in what Zhuge Liang described, no promise of swift resolution. Instead, there was only a quiet unfolding of understanding, one that required patience more than action. "And if one sees clearly," Liu Bei said after a pause, "what then?" Zhuge Liang allowed the question to settle. "Then one does not rush," he replied. The answer was simple, yet it carried a depth that extended beyond its words. "To see clearly is not to act immediately," he continued. "It is to know when action is no longer driven by uncertainty." He rolled the scroll back into place, setting it gently upon the table. "There are times when movement creates progress," he said. "And there are times when stillness does the same." The room grew quiet once more. Outside, the evening had begun to settle over the valley. The air cooled, and the sounds of the day softened into something more distant. A faint breeze moved through the open window, carrying with it the scent of the earth as it released the warmth it had held. Within this stillness, the meaning of Zhuge Liang's words began to take root, not as instruction to be followed, but as something to be understood over time. The plan he described was not laid out in rigid terms. It did not demand immediate execution, nor did it rely on force. Instead, it rested upon a recognition of balance, of knowing where strength could be sustained, where patience would yield more than action, and where the movement of the world itself could be allowed to unfold without interference. For Liu Bei, this was not a moment of sudden realization. It was something quieter, a gradual alignment between what he had experienced and what he was now beginning to understand. The uncertainty he had carried did not disappear, but it changed in nature. It no longer felt like something to be resolved quickly, but something that could be observed, considered, and allowed to settle into clarity. As the evening deepened, Zhuge Liang rose to light a lantern. The flame flickered softly at first, then steadied, casting a warm glow across the room. Shadows moved gently along the walls, shifting with the subtle movements of the light. Neither man spoke for a time. There was nothing more that needed to be said in that moment. The conversation had not ended, but it had reached a point where words were no longer necessary. Outside, the sky darkened into night. The valley remained unchanged, as it always had been. The mountains stood in quiet silence. The bamboo continued its gentle movement, and the rhythm of the land carried on without interruption. Yet within the small cottage, something had taken form. Not a plan to be executed, not a decision to be declared, but a way of seeing. And in that way of seeing, there was the beginning of something that would extend far beyond the valley itself, not through force, nor through urgency, but through the quiet strength of understanding applied with care. Zhuge Liang returned to his seat, his posture unchanged. Liu Bei remained where he was. His thoughts settled not into conclusion, but into a steady awareness that did not need to be rushed. The lantern light held steady between them, and in its quiet glow, the foundations of a future, one shaped not by haste, but by clarity, rested gently, waiting for the moment when it would be carried forward. When the time came for Zhuge Liang to leave the valley of Longzhong, there was no ceremony to mark his departure. The fields remained as they were. The bamboo continued to bend with the wind, unchanged by the absence of the one who had tended the land with quiet care. The cottage stood still, holding within it the traces of a life that had been lived without excess. Nothing in the valley announced that something significant had occurred, and yet, beyond its quiet boundaries, the world had begun to move in response. For Zhuge Liang, the transition was not a shift toward prominence, but toward responsibility. He did not carry himself as one stepping into importance. There was no outward change in his manner, no adjustment made to match the expectations of those who would now look to him for guidance. The same stillness that had shaped his life in Longzhong remained with him, even as his surroundings changed. In the presence of Liu Bei, and among those who served alongside him, Zhuge Liang did not seek to stand apart. He listened. Where others spoke quickly, offering opinions shaped by urgency, he allowed the full measure of a situation to be seen before responding. He did not interrupt, nor did he dismiss. Instead, he observed, not only what was said, but what remained unspoken. It was in these quiet spaces that his presence began to take form, not through authority, but through consistency. When questions were brought before him, he did not answer immediately. There was always a pause, brief but noticeable. In that pause, it seemed as though the question itself was being allowed to settle, to reveal its deeper shape before any response was given. And when he did speak, his words carried no excess. They were measured, clear, and free of urgency. He did not speak to impress, nor to persuade. He spoke only when there was something to be understood. And when there was not, he remained silent without discomfort. Those around him began to notice this. At first, it was subtle. A suggestion offered in passing would later reveal its depth. A moment of restraint, where others might have acted quickly, would prevent complications that had not yet fully appeared. His guidance did not draw attention to itself, yet its effects were felt with increasing clarity. Over time, this quiet steadiness became something others relied upon, not because it demanded trust, but because it earned it, gradually and without force. In the evenings when the responsibilities of the day had settled into silence, Zhuge Liang often remained awake. A lantern would be lit beside him, its glow steady against the darkness. Scrolls would be laid out before him, not in disorder, but in a quiet arrangement that reflected a mind at ease with its work. He wrote, not for recognition, nor for record alone, but as a continuation of thought. Each line was formed with care, the brush moving steadily across the page. There was no haste in his writing. The rhythm of it matched the rhythm of his thinking, measured, deliberate, and free from unnecessary weight. Those who passed by at such hours would sometimes pause, observing from a distance. There was something in the stillness of that scene, the quiet focus, the absence of strain, that left an impression not easily explained. It was not the work itself that stood out. It was the way in which it was done. During the day, his presence remained much the same. He did not seek to lead through command, nor to shape outcomes through force. Instead, he guided through understanding, allowing others to see what had not yet been considered, and to act with a clarity that did not need to be imposed. There were moments when decisions needed to be made, moments where uncertainty pressed more heavily, and where the desire for immediate action grew stronger. In these moments, Zhuge Liang did not resist the need for movement, but neither did he surrender to it. He would speak calmly and without emphasis, bringing attention to what had been overlooked. Often, this was enough. What seemed unclear would begin to settle. What appeared urgent would reveal itself to be less so. And in that shift, decisions would emerge, not as reactions, but as responses grounded in understanding. Liu Bei observed this closely. He did not see in Zhuge Liang the ambition that drove many others, nor the desire for recognition that often accompanied influence. Instead, he saw a steadiness that did not change with circumstance. Whether the situation was simple or complex, whether the outcome was certain or unclear, Zhuge Liang remained as he had always been, present, attentive. unmoved by the need to prove himself. It was in this constancy that his true strength became evident, not in moments of great action, but in the quiet continuity of how he carried himself through each day. As time passed, the responsibilities placed upon him grew. More decisions required his attention. More voices sought his guidance. The weight of service, though carried without complaint, was not without substance. Yet even as this weight increased, there was no visible strain. He did not rush. He did not falter. He did not take on more than what could be held with clarity. Instead, he moved as he always had, one moment at a time, each given the attention it required, and no more. There were no grand declarations of loyalty, no outward displays of dedication, and yet his commitment was unmistakable. It was present in the way he remained when others grew uncertain, in the way he continued when others grew tired, and in the way he carried responsibility, not as a burden imposed upon him, but as something he had chosen to accept. This was not a life of glory. There were no moments designed to be remembered, no actions taken for the sake of recognition, but within the quiet unfolding of each day, something enduring was being formed, a legacy not built on victories, but on the manner in which each moment was met. As the nights grew deeper and the lantern light dimmed, Zhuge Liang would set aside his brush. The scrolls would be rolled and placed where they belonged. The room would return to stillness, holding within it the quiet trace of what had been done. And in that stillness, there was no sense of completion, only the understanding that the work, like the rhythm of the world itself, would continue. Not through force, not through urgency, but through the steady presence of one who did not need either. There are moments in a life that do not arrive with noise. They do not announce themselves, nor do they demand immediate attention. Instead, they settle quietly into place, and only over time does their weight begin to be understood. For Zhuge Liang, such a moment came not as a sudden shift, but as a quiet absence. The presence of Liu Bei, once steady and enduring, was no longer there. And yet, the world did not pause. The responsibilities that had been shared now rested differently, not heavier in appearance, but more complete in their demand. What had once been guided through conversation and mutual understanding now required a different kind of steadiness. There were fewer voices to turn to, fewer moments where uncertainty could be spoken aloud and shaped through exchange. In their place, there was space, a quiet, unfilled space that did not ask to be avoided, but to be held. Zhuge Liang did not resist this. He did not seek to replace what had been lost, nor to fill the absence with action. Instead, he allowed it to remain as it was, present, but not overwhelming. In the early mornings before the dawn had fully begun, he would rise as he always had. The air carried a familiar stillness, though it seemed now to extend a little further. The courtyards were quiet, the paths undisturbed, and the light, as it slowly appeared, revealed a world that had not changed, only shifted in its feeling. He would walk through these spaces without urgency. There were tasks to be done, decisions to be made, and responsibilities that could not be set aside. But none of these required haste. They required presence. When others came to him during this time, their questions carried a different tone. There was uncertainty, yes, but also something else. A quiet awareness that what was being asked of him now extended beyond guidance. It was not only clarity they sought, It was steadiness. Zhuge Liang received these moments as he always had, with attention, without resistance. He listened fully, and when he spoke, his words remained unchanged in their nature. They did not grow heavier, nor did they seek to match the weight of expectation placed upon them. Instead, they remained simple, measured, clear. Yet within that simplicity, there was something more, not added, but revealed. A depth that had always been present, now carried forward without the need for support. In the evenings when the movement of the day had settled, he would often remain alone. The lantern beside him would cast a steady light, illuminating the scrolls laid out before him. The brush in his hand moved with the same quiet precision, forming lines that carried thought without excess. But there were moments now when the brush would pause, not from uncertainty, but from reflection. His gaze would rest, not on the words before him, but on something beyond them. Not distant, not unreachable, just present in a way that did not require definition. The absence he carried did not demand resolution. It did not press for answers, nor did it seek to be set aside. It simply remained, and in remaining, it became part of the stillness he had always known. There was no visible struggle in this, no outward sign that something had been lost. Yet those who observed him closely could sense a quiet deepening, a steadiness that had always been there, now held with even greater clarity. When decisions were placed before him, he did not approach them differently. He did not rush, nor did he delay unnecessarily. Each was given its place. Each was seen for what it was, and each was carried forward without attachment to how it might be received. In this way, the burden he bore was not one of strain. It was one of continuation, a continuation of the same presence that had guided him in Longzhong, that had shaped his service, and that now carried him through a time where the path could no longer be shared in the same way. Days passed, and then more. The rhythm of responsibility did not lessen, but it no longer felt new. It had settled into place, becoming part of the quiet structure of each day, and within that structure, there was no resistance, only movement, steady, unforced, complete in itself. Those who came to rely on him found no change in what they received. There was no increase in authority, no shift in tone, only the same clarity, offered in the same way. Yet now, it carried further. Not because it had grown, but because it was no longer divided. It had become singular, whole. In the quiet hours, when the lantern burned low and the night stretched out beyond the walls, Zhuge Liang would set aside his work. There was nothing left to resolve in those moments, no unfinished thought that required attention, only the quiet awareness of what had been carried and what would continue to be. The absence that had once marked a turning point no longer stood apart. It had become part of the path itself, not something to overcome, but something to walk with. And in that quiet acceptance, there was no heaviness, only a deeper stillness, one that did not remove responsibility, but allowed it to be held without weight. By the time the northern roads began to cool once more, much had already been carried. Responsibility had settled into its place, not as something new, but as something fully accepted. The passing of Liu Bei had not brought sudden change, but a quiet deepening of what had already begun. For Zhuge Liang, there was no moment of hesitation. The path forward had been understood long before it needed to be walked. And so, when preparations were made to move north, they were not driven by urgency, nor by ambition, but by a steady continuation of purpose. The movement itself was unhurried. There were no sudden departures, no sense of rushing toward an outcome. Instead, each step followed the last with measured consistency. The road stretched long and open, winding through plains that seemed to extend without end. The land carried a quiet vastness, one that did not resist movement, but did not encourage haste either. The air was often still. At times, a soft wind would pass across the fields, bending the tall grasses in gentle waves before settling once more into calm. The sky above remained wide and uninterrupted, shifting slowly from morning light into the deeper tones of evening, and then into night. Within this landscape, the presence of movement felt almost secondary. Zhuge Liang traveled as he lived, without excess. He did not ride ahead, nor did he remain behind. His place was neither elevated nor removed. He moved among those who followed, his attention resting not on the idea of progress, but on the condition of each moment as it unfolded. There were times when the journey paused, not because it was necessary, but because there was no need to continue without clarity. In these pauses, the stillness of the land seemed to deepen. The sounds of movement would fade, replaced by something quieter. The distant call of birds, the soft shifting of earth beneath resting feet, the faint rhythm of wind moving across open ground. It was in these moments that Zhuge Liang remained most at ease. He did not fill the silence. He allowed it. Those around him began to understand this in their own way. What might have once felt like delay came to be seen differently, not as hesitation, but as a form of attention, a way of allowing what was not yet clear to settle into place before moving forward. There were plans, of course. There were considerations to be made, paths to be chosen, and outcomes to be weighed. But these were not approached with urgency. They were observed, shaped, and adjusted with a patience that did not seek immediate resolution. When Zhuge Liang spoke, it was often in quiet tones. He would point not to what needed to be done quickly, but to what needed to be understood fully. A change in direction, when it came, was rarely abrupt. It emerged gradually, as though it had always been present, waiting only to be recognized. Those who traveled with him found themselves adapting to this rhythm, where once there may have been a desire to move faster, to act more decisively. That impulse began to soften. In its place grew a steadiness, an understanding that progress did not come from speed alone, but from alignment with what could be sustained. Days passed in this way, then weeks. The northern lands did not resist them, nor did they yield easily. They remained as they were, vast, open, and indifferent to intention. And yet, within that indifference, something subtle took place. The journey itself became the work, not the arrival, nor the outcome, but the continued presence within each step, each pause, each decision made without force. There were moments when expectations from others rose. Questions would surface about timing, about direction, about when something more definitive would occur. These questions were not unreasonable. They came from a place of wanting clarity, of wanting to see movement reflected in visible change. Zhuge Liang did not dismiss them. He listened, as he always had. And when he responded, it was not to quiet the question, but to place it within a broader understanding. Not all movement is seen immediately, he would say, his voice even. and not all progress reveals itself in the moment it is made. There was no attempt to convince, only a quiet offering of perspective. In time, this was enough. The desire for immediate results began to settle, replaced by a deeper awareness of the rhythm that guided their path. It was not a rhythm imposed from outside, nor dictated by expectation. It was something that emerged naturally, shaped by the land, the moment, and the clarity with which each step was taken. As the seasons shifted, so too did the atmosphere of the journey. The warmth of the days softened into cooler air. The light changed, becoming gentler, more diffused. The land, once open and expansive, took on a quieter tone, as though reflecting the steadiness of those who moved across it. Through it all, Zhuge Liang remained unchanged. He did not seek recognition for what was being carried forward. He did not measure progress by visible markers, nor by the approval of others. Instead, he continued. Each moment received the same attention as the last. Each decision made without urgency. Each step taken with the understanding that what mattered most was not how quickly something was achieved, but how it was carried. In the evenings when the movement of the day came to rest, he would sit quietly. The sky above stretched wide and clear, filled with stars that appeared one by one as the light faded. There was no need to speak during these times. The presence of the night itself was enough. The wind would move gently across the land, carrying with it a coolness that settled into stillness. And within that stillness, there was no sense of striving, only the quiet continuation of a path that did not need to be forced forward. For those who observed him, this became the true measure of his legacy. Not the outcomes that might one day be remembered, not the plans that might be recorded, but the way in which he moved through each moment. Steady, unhurried, and free from the need to grasp at what had not yet come. The northern road stretched on. The journey continued. And within its quiet unfolding, Zhuge Liang remained as he had always been. Present, attentive, and at ease within the space between action and stillness. As the seasons continued their quiet turning, the rhythm of the journey began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to soften. The movement that had once carried purpose across distant lands no longer stretched as far. The pauses grew longer. The days unfolded with less demand, as though the path itself had begun to narrow. Not in direction, but in scope. For Zhuge Liang, there was no sense of interruption in this change, only continuation. He remained as he had always been, present within each moment, without resistance to what it brought. The weight he carried had never been something he spoke of. It had been taken on quietly, accepted without declaration, and held with the same steadiness that had guided him from the valley of Longzhong to the roads beyond. Now, as the world around him moved at a gentler pace, that weight seemed to settle into stillness. There was less to be done, and yet nothing felt unfinished. In the quiet hours of the evening, he would sit outside, where the air had cooled and the sky opened wide above him. The land, once marked by movement and intention, had returned to a kind of quiet openness. The sounds of the day faded into distance, leaving behind only the soft presence of the night. There was a familiarity in this stillness. It was not unlike the valley he had once called home. The same gentle wind, the same distant rhythm of the earth at rest, the same unspoken understanding that nothing needed to be rushed. Zhuge Liang did not reflect in the way others might. He did not revisit each moment, nor did he measure what had been accomplished against what had been hoped for. There was no need to arrange the past into meaning. It had already taken its shape, one moment at a time. Instead, he simply remained where he was, aware of the quiet around him, aware of the steady rise and fall of breath, aware of the space that existed when nothing more was required. Those who came to see him during this time often found the same presence they had always known. There was no change in his manner, no sign of strain, no indication that the years had altered the way he carried himself. If anything, there was a softness now, a quiet easing into stillness that did not take anything away, but gently reduced what was no longer needed. When he spoke, his words were fewer, not because there was less to say, but because there was less that needed to be spoken. A question would be asked. He would listen, and after a pause, he would offer something simple, something that did not seek to resolve everything at once, but allowed the question itself to settle. In this way, even now, he continued to guide, not through direction, but through presence. One evening, as the light faded more slowly than usual, the sky took on a deep, steady calm. The horizon softened into shades of dusk, and the first stars began to appear, not all at once, but gradually, as though revealing themselves only when the light had fully released its hold. Zhuge Liang sat beneath this sky, as he had many times before. There was no effort in his posture, no tension held in place, only a quiet stillness shaped by a life that had not been rushed. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying with it a coolness that settled without resistance. It passed through the trees, over the open ground, and into the quiet space where he sat, as though it had always known the way. There were no thoughts that needed to be followed, no decisions waiting to be made. The path he had walked had not been one of sudden turns or dramatic shifts. It had been steady, formed through attention, shaped by patience, and carried forward without the need to force its direction. And now, as the night deepened, that same steadiness remained, not as something held onto, but as something that had become part of the quiet itself. The stars continued to appear, filling the sky with a soft, distant light. They did not demand attention. They did not ask to be understood. They simply existed, steady, quiet, and unchanged by the movement of the world below. Zhuge Liang's gaze rested there, not searching, not questioning, only observing. There was a sense in that moment that nothing more needed to be added, nothing more needed to be done. The work that had once filled each day had not disappeared, but it no longer required effort. It had been carried as far as it needed to go, and now it rested, as all things eventually do. In the distance, the faint sound of wind moved across the land once more. It came and went without interruption, leaving behind the same quiet it had found. The night held steady, and within it, there was no urgency, no expectation, only the gentle presence of a world at rest. Zhuge Liang remained there for a time. Though time itself had begun to lose its shape, there was no need to measure it, no reason to follow it, only the quiet awareness of being exactly where he was. And then, as the stillness deepened, even that awareness began to soften. The sounds of the night grew more distant. The space around him widened, not in form, but in feeling. And within that space, there was nothing left to hold, nothing left to carry, only the quiet continuation of a presence that no longer needed to move. The stars remained, The wind passed gently, and the world in all its motion settled into rest. And so, the path comes to rest, not with an ending, but with a quiet stillness that has always been there. And so, the path comes to rest, not with an ending, but with a quiet stillness that has always been there. The life of Zhuge Liang was never shaped by urgency, nor defined by moments of noise. It was carried forward through attention, through patience, and through a steady presence that did not need to rush. And now, as the night settles around you, there is nothing left to follow. There is no path to continue, and no thought that needs to be held. There is only the quiet space that remains. If you are still listening, you can allow the story to drift, just as the wind moves through the trees, present for a moment, and then gently gone. The night is steady. The world is at rest. And like the stillness he carried, you can rest here too, without effort and without urgency, just as you are.